from MapR, and of course our moderator, Cade Metz of Wired Enterprise. Thank you all for being here. Our thanks also go out to Cloudera, especially Terry Olinsky for her work, and to Oracle, especially Susan Aumack, for their work and support in helping to put this program together. Thank you very much. It's great to see such an amazing audience for this program. We've got a veritable who's who of Silicon Valley and people from across the country and indeed the world. We've got people here from Boston, Boulder, Chicago, Seattle, New York, New England, Los Angeles, the UK, and other places. I hope you're ready for a great Churchill-style discussion and debate about Hadoop and big data. Remember, you are the reason we're holding this discussion. If someone doesn't ask a question or bring up a topic you think is important, there is a Q&A at the end, and ask for a mic and get the question on the table. We've got a VC roundtable coming up this Thursday. That's sold out, but we do have space next week. We're doing a very interesting event with the Oxford Union, the Great Silicon Valley Oxford Union debate on Tuesday, June 19th. It's about entrepreneurs and their ability to solve the critical problems of the future. I encourage you to make an extra effort to attend. We're doing this in conjunction with the Save Business School at Oxford. And it will unfold in the classic Oxford Union style, so it will not just be informative, but also quite entertaining. By the way, it's a perfect opportunity for high school or college students or interns to gain understanding about technology and the world around us and the art of persuasion. If people are students, they're welcome to attend for free. Just have them contact Churchill Club at info@churchillclub.org. And then finally, if you're tweeting, please use hashtag Churchill Club, and you'll find other Twitter codes in your program. Let me now introduce our moderator, Cade Metz. He's a senior editor with Wired. He oversees a new section of Wired called Wired Enterprise, focused on the people, the ideas, the hardware, and the software sitting behind every machine we use. Please join me in welcoming Cade and kicking off the panel. Thank you.
I've been covering Hadoop for about 3 or 4 years now, since it was sort of being incubated inside of Yahoo and Facebook and other places. And I think that 3 or 4 years later, I'm just finally getting to the point where I can grasp the state of the situation. There's a lot of technology to get through. There's a lot of politics to get through. So I'm glad that we have this group in particular on stage. What I thought we would do is start with each of our panelists giving kind of their state of the Hadoop market. And it seems like maybe we should start with Jay, who's with Facebook, one of the companies, along with Yahoo and a few others, who kind of bootstrapped this several years ago, to talk about the state of things. Hadoop today is a technology that drives not only Facebook and Yahoo, but several other big-name websites, small-name websites. And it began as a web technology, but what we're here to talk about today is how it's moving into the average businesses. But maybe we could start with what Facebook and Jay have seen and how things stand as of 2012.
Right, so we've been obviously using Facebook for a really long time. We've cut our teeth on very early versions and trying to make it work for different applications. I think the general view on the market for me is that it's very fragmented. It's really hard to find the signal from the noise out there. There's a lot of hype out there and really trying to figure out how to come up and craft the right solution for your evolving needs. For us, it's one of massive scale. So we've done a lot of work to basically enable this platform across the entire business so that anybody in the company can put data in it, anybody can get data out of it, and it's also something that's caused issues in terms of like how much money we spend with this, what's the admission control for this access and this sort of free access to data. I think these scaling problems are things that Yahoo and Facebook and others are at the tip of the curve kind of hitting, but everybody in this room, if you're now using Hadoop and it's cool and it's you're getting some reports out of this, 2 years from now you're going to have all of these same problems in terms of scaling, admission control, efficiency, all of the different applications that run on Hadoop. It's not just a platform. As in Facebook, we have dozens of use cases that actually run on here. Reporting and coming up with stats and metrics is one part of it. It's an important part of it, but it is like so much more broader. And the frameworks like MapReduce and stuff like that really do need to extend and offer, and we need to come up with new things that we can do on this platform so that we can service different use cases.
Mike Olson, sitting to Jay's right, was one of the first people to sort of recognize that this web technology could be extended to the average business. Given what Jay has just said, where are we with the enterprise, so to speak?
Usually when I get to do one of these panels, I can say, well, Cloudera's been in business for 4 years, longer than anybody else in the Hadoop market. Actually, props to you, man. Absolutely right that the web properties created and explored the use cases for this platform well in advance of everyone else. And I think what we recognized in 2008 was that the platform that had been invented at Google, had been perfected at places like Facebook and Yahoo, wasn't designed to compete with existing data management infrastructure. It was aimed at a different problem, a new problem that those guys discovered first because they had more data than anyone else, but that the rest of the market would discover. The decision to collaborate on an open source project by those early vendors was genius. It meant that the platform evolved much faster than it would otherwise have done, and it eased adoption in more enterprises. What it meant was that more use cases happened earlier than they would have otherwise. You can say, we can say, we've done a lot of work to support customers in production. The early releases were painful to use. I think that is much less true today. Substantial investment by the community generally, certainly by Cloudera, but also by the big consumers of the technology, have driven the state of the platform now to the point really where customers can roll out production use cases. Continued collaboration on open source is important to us for a bunch of reasons, but those original reasons, better collaboration, more developers working together, and frictionless adoption, wide distribution, those are the key advantages that the open source platform confers. And I think that that's really fundamental to what this platform is and will drive adoption. If I had to say right now, state of the market, I'd say that the platform is enterprise ready. We certainly see large-scale enterprise production in financial services, telco, retail, government and intelligence, and elsewhere. The challenge really is in business user-facing applications. What is it that you run? What apps can you buy? What visualization tools can you fire up on big data? And there I think the story is earlier stage. There is less available. Not nothing. There are some very interesting companies, large established vendors, Informatica, MicroStrategy, and others. And then emerging vendors as well, building analytics that run on that platform. But you can consume it in lots of different ways, on appliances and in open source distributions, on whatever hardware you like. Getting access to those applications is going to be the key business driver, I think, in the next 12, 18 months. And it's certainly a place that we're paying a lot of attention ourselves.
Mike Driscoll, to my left, is a longtime Hadoop user with his company Metamarkets, which does data analysis or data science as a service. Where do you see the state of things?
Well, I think I was talking earlier at the table about what makes for a good panel at the Churchill Club, and someone said controversy. So to be somewhat controversial, I think that the state of the market is what I've called a Hadoop hangover. I think that a lot of companies, 12 to 18 months ago, had this belief that Hadoop was the panacea. And I think a lot of executives felt we need Hadoop. And if you ask many of those executives what Hadoop was, they would say, I have no idea, but I think we need it. So I think that, but I will agree with Mike that it's ultimately about, this is an extraordinarily valuable platform. But the challenge with Hadoop is that it is not a panacea, and it's a technology, not a solution. And I think there's opportunity for different classes of problems that need to be addressed in big data, specifically around interactive dialogues with your data. the ability to ask a question and get a response in human time. And the challenge with Hadoop is it's not like having a conversation with your data. It's like having a pen pal who you write to once in a while, and a few weeks later you get a response. So I think that the challenge is moving away from these batch-oriented systems towards more real-time interactive systems. Nonetheless, there is an absolutely critical role for Hadoop. But as we move up the stack, I think there's a whole host of applications at the visualization layer involving analytics that will be based upon Hadoop, but will facilitate that faster user experience. And I think these things are not antagonistic. I think they're complementary.
Michael, in fairness, it's like having 1,000 pen pals.
It's like having 1,000 pen pals who all write back to you.
Got it. Well, that's a good segue to John Schroeder, who's with MapR, and you guys are moving into this real-time aspect already, correct?
Well, yeah, I mean, Hadoop's the first really popular batch-only platform since like 1968 or something. So it's got to move more toward real-time and be able to respond to real-time queries. It was interesting. I think Mike was mentioning, some of the customers that are implementing Hadoop, and they're major financial services companies, right? Aerospace companies like Hadoop. And Cade, your opening comments were, this works for Facebook. Now it's starting to roll out to ordinary companies. So it really shows we're in a different marketplace. We used to seek the financial services market first, and you can see that kind of the Web 2.0 is leading the way. I think the state of the market is, it's really changed. I think it was very experimental. I think you were trying to figure out what would be your use case, what data is at your fingertips that you could use, what sort of business value could you gain out of it. So it was more on that sort of experimental basis over the last couple of years. I think now we are seeing serious apps up in production, and they are becoming, bet your business on these applications kind of mission critical. So I think it's really changed now more toward enhancements like real time, but also, can I run this in a 5 nines availability? Can I run this and depend on this as a platform? And I think there's another piece of this, which is you got to expand the use cases. So expanding the APIs available for Hadoop and being able to access it from a broader set of tools, I think also builds its value inside both Web 2.0 and enterprise accounts.
One of the other, I guess, still prevailing misconceptions is that Hadoop will somehow, crush the likes of Oracle. But I think that Andy would disagree with that. You're now offering Hadoop in an appliance alongside other things. It's a complementary service to what you do, or
That's
have
right.
done in the past.
Yeah, so let's give a little context to where we are in Oracle in this whole world. So, we are a relational database company. Among other things we do now at Oracle. I run the database group, and we have, for many years, had lots of customers using massively parallel relational databases for doing business analytics. And so the big question is, how does Hadoop, I guess, fit into the enterprise analytics space? And what we're seeing from our customers is sort of interesting. We have huge petabyte scale relational databases now that people do analytics on, and they stream and ingest huge amounts of data in real time and all that kind of cool stuff. But what the customers we talk to seem to be really excited about is they want to go out on the internet and they want to get out all this information that's on Facebook and Twitter and on the blogs. And if they're a consumer-facing organization, they want to find out what their customers are up to, or it's not necessarily customers, it can be patients at a healthcare organization. And they want to use that information to basically enrich the information they have in their big data warehouses today. So for example, your Kaiser Permanente, they want to mine the internet and find out all the patients that are unhappy with them and call them up and make things good again. And the retailers want to find, they want to go on Facebook. All these guys want to go on Facebook, all that data there, that most of it is not very interesting. But, those baby pictures are really interesting to those retailers, who want to sell you baby clothing. So those guys want to go on Facebook. They want to be your friend and find out you've got the baby and add that, again, enrich that information into their structured data warehouses. And so I think that's where we see this Hadoop fit in. Hadoop is a great platform for ingesting this data, and sifting through this massive information, most of which isn't that valuable to your enterprise, but every so often there's something really important. They want to take that data, they want to merge it into their relational data warehouses, enrich their data warehouses so they can actually be more successful in their business. So that's sort of how we position the two technologies. We think Hadoop is a great complement to Oracle Relational Database. And as you said, we're in the data appliance business now, so we have an appliance for Hadoop that we call the Big Data Appliance. It can sit next to Exadata, which is our database machine, and Exalytics, which is our BI appliance, to give customers a full analytic solution.
Well, Mike Olson and John alluded to this. One of the traditional problems with Hadoop was that maybe it wasn't as robust as it could be. At Facebook, Jay says he has maybe a team of 60 people who oversee the use of Hadoop. If things go down, he's got the manpower and the brains to get things back up quickly. Have things evolved over the past few years in terms of high availability, as they call it, HA?
Who was that to?
Huh? To Jay.
I think overall, yes. I think the community has spun up a number of projects over the year and a half around HA, around performance. But I don't think I think it's still not where it needs to be. The problem keeps moving faster and faster away as the amount of data that you have in the system continues to grow at sort of these exponential rates across the board. At Facebook, a single cluster, and we have hundreds of different clusters, but our single largest cluster today is well over 100 petabytes in size. And this is one cluster. It's the biggest cluster, over 100 petabytes of data, right? So when I think about sort of scalability and high availability, all that kind of is garbage, because it's like we have like all of this data. We need to make it available all the time for everybody, and we still need to be able to iterate on top of this platform in a really rapid way. I can't shut down the platform to upgrade thousands of nodes and coordinate all of these installs and try to do all this dependency mapping and to deal with all of the different customers that manage this. So it's nowhere where it needs to be from a scaling perspective or a reliability perspective. We obviously are working really hard on this. There are other stuff that Cloudera and Yahoo and others are doing to address this. But it is one of the things that I think is a shortfall right now.
Can I ask? I mean, do you do upgrades to your Hadoop cluster? And if
Yeah.
so, how do you do it?
Yeah, carefully.
And so, Michael, what are you guys doing to address this? I mean, when customers come to you and they talk about these issues, what do you tell them?
Well, I'll make a couple points. I mean, Jay, with respect, we're running a 100 petabyte cluster, and scalability is not where it needs to be. Yeah, maybe not for you, dude, right? But most of the people in this room
I totally agree.
absolutely
Totally agree.
are going to have some headroom.
But
at
that's
that
my
scale.
point, is that like a year from now or 2 years from now, these are going to be problems that everybody's going to have. Right?
That's right.
100 petabytes 2 years from now is going to be boring.
So the point I wanted to make there specifically was, it is great that the web properties continue to push the frontier forward. You guys are driving consumption of this platform at a scale that no one else does, and that's why we like to watch closely what you are doing. So the community now, and substantially with help from Cloudera for sure, has solved the single point of failure. There was one component in Hadoop that was widely derided for not being highly available. That's fixed. The open source platform now has that working. That isn't, by the way, the code that Facebook is running. Facebook has done a lot of custom engineering on its infrastructure in order to get to that scale about 3 years ahead of the rest of the community. Now, the ideas, the work that those folks are doing, visible broadly, and certainly has influenced the activity of the community. I'd argue that for the enterprise deployments we're seeing, absolutely performance and scalability issues are addressed. Not that we're going to meet your 100 petabyte scalability, but that the platform will get there over time as the broader market follows in your footsteps. There's not a lot of rocket science in how you build large-scale distributed systems, right? We've been doing that stuff since the 1970s. In fact, the really interesting early work was done by relational database researchers, right? It is a matter of engineering discipline and attention, and the open source project merely needed that attention. So enterprise adoption drives enterprise vendors to do the kind of work for which they can be paid, and thereby the platform gets steadily better. And I'd put Hadoop up against any other commercially available piece of software these days in terms of its scale and its availability. It's not to say it's flawless, but it is sufficient for the workloads that we are seeing for sure, and absolutely supportable and used in mission-critical use in our install base.
And that single point of failure you talk about, is that the name node you're
That's
discussing?
for those of you who follow along at home, that's the name node, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, explain to them what that is and why that's an issue.
When you put data into a Hadoop cluster, you want to know where it is when you're going to go get it again. And this is the guy that keeps track of where that is. There was one computer that knew where all the data was. So you didn't have to talk to that computer to get your data. The data didn't flow through that computer, but you had to go ask that computer, where is my table? Where are my records? If that guy went south, you're blind. You don't know where to go. Well, it turns out that there are techniques like replication and hot failover and so on, well attested in the industry. That had just never been built into Hadoop in the early days. What happened, in fact, was if your name node went down, you threw a rope around the nearest 6 Stanford PhDs in your data center, and you took them down and fixed the problem, right? But software is a better way to do that, and the software now has been fixed to do that.
Now, John, when you started MapR and you saw these problems with the platform, you guys worked for a good 2 years or so to kind of re-architect things. You're using an entirely new file system, correct? Explain what you did.
Yeah, I mean, what we do is we do aggregate the technology from 12 open source projects. So Hadoop's not a project. There's a number of projects and components. So you've got like Hive, there's a SQL access, language access to Hadoop, and Zookeeper is a resource manager, and Mahout is a machine learning library. So, so there isn't an open source project, there's a number of projects. So we take 12 of those projects, we integrate those in with IP that we built at MapR, and we integrate it, test it, apply the latest patches, and we provide that to the market both as a free distribution you can run at any scale with no limits to how much data or how many nodes you have in a cluster. And then like most companies that execute in an open source environment, we also provide an upsell to an enterprise class edition that has backup and some additional high availability features and such. So you know, that's how we approach the market. And I think the response to things like high availability, I think the two responses here are really very valid, is if you've got the engineering resource and you've got the room full of Stanford PhDs that you have, it's Facebook, you can make Hadoop run and you can make it scale up to 100 petabytes. I think most organizations don't have that level of resources, and they need something to really support more what they're doing with all their other systems, which is like lights out data center, right? And the response being that there was a single point of failure and that's been fixed, we really approached it from another standpoint, is upgrade, for example. How do you do a rolling upgrade? There's other components in the system, like, to get into technical jargon, there's a job tracker component that runs your jobs for you and creates MapR and reducer jobs, distributes them across the cluster, and that also requires, you know, active stateful failover. So we approached it a little differently. We built in, you know, active stateful failover to every component in the system, and rolling upgrades and point-in-time recovery, and all the aspects you need to really kind of support that sort of implementation. So, and the premise being for mass adoption, you need to be able to support that sort of level of operations, because most companies aren't going to have the access to talent and the scope of engineering that Facebook does to run this type of an application platform.
So Andy, where do you see the state of things in terms of this HA question?
Well, actually, you know, if we look at the adoption of Hadoop in the enterprise, I think one of the other things you mentioned is this issue about skills. You know, you mentioned Facebook has all these great skills for running the Hadoop platform, and the other issue around skills is developing the MapReduce programs. And so I think when I talk to the enterprise customers, that's their number one issue. They do not have the PhDs from Stanford that Facebook has, and Google has, and whatever. And so they want to understand, well, how do I get access to this platform? And I think that's one of the areas where we're going to try to make a contribution at Oracle, because our customers, you know, like, they know how to use relational databases. There's this whole ecosystem of BI tools around relational databases. They would like all that stuff to work against Hadoop, and it will probably someday. But one of the things we think we can accelerate is to help get this whole ecosystem that knows how to run on Oracle run against Hadoop by basically making Oracle SQL more accessible, or be able to reach out into the Hadoop space, so you can actually then get this whole stack of stuff around Oracle working. The other area customers, I think, are concerned about is security. You know, once you have all this data, they get very nervous about there being really good security in the Hadoop space. And I think that's another big concern customers have is, when are we going to have enterprise, what they consider enterprise class security? So.
And Mike Driscoll, do you?
Well, I think that on the high availability piece, I think it's pretty interesting because I think that high availability and boxes really don't go along well together. I think it's interesting that I think of Oracle and SAP and others are still in this business of sort of big box retailing, and I think for me it's almost an oxymoron to talk about a big data appliance because I think big data is too big to fit on any single box. The beautiful thing about Hadoop is how scalable it is, how you can add nodes, flexibly scale over as your data ramps up, which I think is harder to do with some of the appliances. But I think for me, the bigger issue around this focus on appliances and technology when it comes to availability is one of sort of licensed software versus services. And I think that ultimately where we're all moving is hopefully away from this world where we have to even maintain and manage our own clusters of machines. It's similar to managing our own data is kind of like managing your own data pipeline is kind of like managing your own mail pipeline. We have something called the Postal Service that moves our mail around for us, and I think ultimately we should be looking for services to help us move our data around. And we're a bit away from that, but I think that's the vision, to get away from these unreliable boxes and unreliable clusters that we have to hire, lasso 8 Stanford PhDs to come in and fix. What we actually want is, a service that just is up and runs. So that's kind of my take on this, is that we want to migrate away from this. And certainly the companies that are here, I think, will be the foundation for many of those businesses that offer the services. And I obviously have a dog in this hunt, but I think it's a migration towards services that will sort of address these issues.
So Andy, your company offers a big data appliance.
Right.
I take it you see things a bit differently.
Just to explain things, the big data appliance is a building block. So it's an 18-node Hadoop cluster out of the box. And if you want a 100-node Hadoop cluster, you buy 6 of them. You connect them together via InfiniBand, and you have a 100-node cluster. So there's no scalability issue around appliances. And we found.
How long does it take to get the shipment of that additional box?
Well, it's a manufacturing process. I don't think that's a big issue for our customers, but we find, I think, cloud and engineered systems or appliances are actually trying to address very similar problems. If I'm a business and I'm running, a healthcare business or a telco, I don't want to be in the business of being an IT systems integrator. And I think the cloud and the engineered systems or appliances space are both addressing that issue. It's like customers want to focus on their business, and they don't want to be, designing complex computer systems. And so I think the appliances are sort of an evolution on the path towards a full, utility computing or cloud model. And we like both. We like clouds. We like appliances too. And I think they're good in the case for databases. They're also interesting for Hadoop as well.
So Jay, where do you come down on this issue? I mean, obviously, when Hadoop was first developed, part of the attraction was it ran on commodity hardware. Cheap servers you could throw into your data center when you needed them. When one failed, another one would pick up the slack. Does this sort of appliance model, does the hardware make a difference?
I think that we're still very early on in terms of the intersection of sort of Hadoop, the use cases, the amount of data that's on it, and then the underlying hardware. I think there are many different use cases out there that will require different types of models, right? There may be certain enterprises that prefer Oracle. Hey, I'd rather just have 6 columns of these big things and just put that in a closet, and that's fine. There are other companies like Facebook that would prefer thousands of machines because we can do other things with them, and we don't want the operational complexity, or we don't have the technical, know-how to run InfiniBand, which we thankfully don't. For us, like I think
Stanford PhDs. Jeez.
they don't teach them everything. So, for us, I think that we've done work on Open Compute. So Open Compute's an initiative that we launched a little over a year ago, and then we formed a foundation with Intel, Rackspace, Goldman Sachs, Andy Bechtolsheim, and us to basically kind of drive innovation in hardware and servers a lot more aggressively, right? So I think in fact, we just had our summit a couple of months ago in San Antonio. One of the big topics was there was big data on top of Open Compute hardware. And what should we be doing in terms of these storage devices to handle different types of big data computation, whether it be MapReduce or whether it be something else out there going forward. So I think we're really, really, really early on in figuring out, at least from, my interest is keep running this on commodity hardware, optimize the hardware, optimize the cost, and keep working on this for kind of scaling out on commodity servers.
Right. You bring up Open Compute, and you talk about optimizing the hardware, but Open Compute is about, in a sense, scaling things down, making them simpler, right? So you can use more of these. I mean, it sort of is a contrast to the Oracle model, right? I mean, is what a web company needs in terms of hardware running Hadoop that different from what another business might need?
I think it really just boils down to your TCO. Do the analysis, figure out what works for you in terms of performance, capability, the capacity of this thing, and what it's going to cost you in terms of what you're familiar with, right? We have a lot of tools in Facebook that allow us to scale and manage thousands of servers without thinking about it, right? We've spent a lot of time investing in how do you administer these servers where 100 servers show up at a time, you drop them on the floor, you plug them in, and they show up and they're serving traffic. There's a lot of that automation that we've invested in. So for us, doing something custom for some other appliance is a one-off is awkward for us. Right? We'd much rather just deal with this thing that's, hey, if that thing dies, who cares? Like, move on to the next one. We don't have to worry about any one device or one rack or even a entire data center being essential for our operations.
So, Mike, also, can you speak for your customers? What sort of hardware do they use?
Yeah, so actually I want to tell a long story, and then I want to talk a little bit about Open Compute. So 4 years ago, summer 2008, we crafted a captivating work of fiction called a business plan. And we took it around to the venture capitalists to raise money. And in that business plan, we forecast that a major source of revenue for Cloudera would be hosted Hadoop. So we were going to stand up a big cluster, and you bring us your data, and we'll run your general purpose Hadoop jobs. And I would say it's different from what Metamarkets is doing. We weren't offering higher level analytics services. We were just running your bare naked Hadoop, and you would have to write whatever analytics jobs you wanted to write. And there was surprising intense interest in that offering when we rolled it out. But here is what we discovered. Everybody wants their big data platform right next to their big data sources and sinks. So yeah, we'll run your Hadoop, but our early customers asked, would you run my Oracle and my web server? And we thought, there is a business that does that, and it's called Amazon Web Services, right? And we quickly exited that business. You want your data processing infrastructure to be next to the rest of your data management infrastructure, wherever that is. And it may be in AWS, and it may be on leased hardware at Rackspace, and it may be on engineered systems in your data center, or it may be on commodity rack-mounted hardware from name brand vendors that you buy. We don't care. We've got customers that run in all of those places. Fundamentally, the customer needs to be able to choose where they want to deploy the systems in order to get the business value that they see. So we absolutely see people deploying on commodity hardware rack-mounted. We do see customers expressing real interest in packaged, engineered systems that they can just order from a vendor they know and trust and get installed because their data center staff and their analysts know how to work with that stuff. I think the Open Compute project is really interesting, and we are early and enthusiastic and active members. But I think that the motivation for that project and the web properties is clear, maybe a little bit less clear, even in a company like mine. And I have one of the biggest Hadoop clusters in the world just because we have to scale up and test. Not the biggest, but one of. The challenge that a company like Facebook has is they build a 2,000-node Hadoop cluster out of commodity servers, and they've got 12,000 USB ports powered at 5 volts DC. And come on, man. I mean, why would you do that? So they'd like to strip those machines down to as simple a system as they can possibly deploy for power and for cooling and just for fewer components that are going to fail. But come on, in your organization, do you really want to buy custom boards from manufacturers in Taiwan and assemble your computers, or even buy white box computers that are non-standard? Or would you rather call up your Dell or your HP or your IBM dealer who sells you computers you already know how to order? Again, the customer needs to decide how to do that. It should be possible to consume the software in any way you like, in your data center, in the cloud, on general purpose or special purpose systems, but it needs to be a decision that the business user makes, and certainly we see people deploy our software in all of those environments.
I do agree that everybody needs to make their own decision. I do think that as we move to larger and larger clusters for those folks that are going to stay on commodity hardware, that there's a bunch of sort of other elements that kick in here, which is, okay, when I have to repair machines in the facility, so I have a 1,000-node cluster for some of you, a year from now or whatever it might be, and it's like I have to spend money paying people to go do repairs. Do you want them to be spending 4 or 5x, the time to repair a machine that they would normally do for a standard sort of OEM white box, kind of like, here's my standard server off the shelf, it's running Hadoop, or do you want to spend way less time doing those repairs? Do you want to actually have greater savings in cost, and do you actually want to use less electricity, right? So if we can do stuff there in terms of open compute and driving the innovation around using less energy, driving more cost efficiency in this platform, I think that's going to be another option. I'm not saying it's everybody's going to adopt this wholesale. I don't think it's right for everybody. I agree with you, Mike, but I do think that it's an option that is lacking in the market today.
I want to be clear. I think that it is an excellent idea, and it's not merely companies like Facebook and Yahoo and Amazon that are looking at this architecture, but the big banks on Wall Street absolutely are enthusiastically participating in the Open Compute project. I do think you're right. As clusters get bigger and as the compute infrastructure that we buy and deploy gets more expensive and larger, it's going to be a lot more important to pay attention to this stuff. It's just like, though, the invention of Hadoop in the first place, in my view. There is a population of early adopters that's like 5 standard deviations out on the curve, and God bless you guys, right? You're going to make sure that the ecosystem is all ready and the roads are paved and the houses are built when we show up.
In relation to this, though, on the cloud, I think, in the first year of our company, just to support our QA lab, we put about 20 tons of air conditioning on the roof, and we had an electrician there continuing, adding more amps to the data center room, and so it becomes pretty clear to you that the cloud's a great alternative. On the other hand, it takes a massive amount of skill to build out the cloud, hence, Amazon being such a gorilla in that market, who does a good business around elastic map reduce already today. So, I think 10 years from now, we will see more data sitting next to your Hadoop cluster in the cloud, and that's a great trend going forward. With the appliances, I think some of the reason the appliances aren't clearly compelling is they're not very highly differentiated. So, while you do have InfiniBand and a preloaded rack, and you've got some increased reliability around making sure you've already tested the software stack and the right version of Linux and the right drivers and things like that, there really isn't a big price performance advantage that's been brought to market by any of the appliance providers. And we have a couple of appliance form factors that MapR sold on. And I think what we'll see near the end of the year, beginning of next year, we'll start seeing some appliance configurations that are really tuned for Hadoop. So you'll really see a real added value with regard to price performance that'll make an appliance more compelling than just, I prepackaged this to make it a little bit easier for you to plug in a rack.
So you think that the use of Hadoop in the proverbial cloud will increase over time, and will that happen just on Amazon, as Mike sort of alluded to, or will we have people challenge them? Is that even on the cards?
There's different classes of cloud vendors out there, right? So you've got Amazon as kind of more of a commercial grade, plug in and spin up a 100-node Hadoop cluster on EMR really quickly. But I spoke at a cloud conference about 2 months ago, and there's another class of vendors that is really hosting your data center in the cloud, like a Savvis or a SunGard, and I think so it's a compelling offering for them. So I think you will see some Amazon competitors enter the market. but you also have another class that's more, hosting your data center in the cloud. And I can't imagine that becoming less popular. It's got to become more popular in the future just because it's hard to solve the problems. If you look at the problems that vendors like Amazon have had to solve, they've figured out power, cooling. They've located data centers near a hydroelectric dam in a state that's very friendly to energy-consuming businesses. I mean, they've thought through a lot of things that are very difficult for the standard, what you termed as the ordinary companies out there to figure out, right?
Mike, you have something to add there?
Yeah, no, I was going to make a couple points. So we talk about Amazon because that's shorthand for the public cloud. But let's be honest, Microsoft wants to get there with Azure. VMware is doing some. There are a lot of public cloud providers. My own view is that the service we offered at Cloudera in that first year, that just, we're going to host your Hadoop for you, not really such an interesting service, right? Look at the successful cloud providers today. Actually, let's begin with Metamarkets, an interesting business user-focused application. Think about Salesforce, right? What you're buying there is Salesforce automation. Hey, by the way, you are a huge Oracle database customer by accident if you're running on Salesforce, but you don't pay attention to that. Workday, right? HR and people management built on a whole bunch of infrastructure, including big data infrastructure and in-memory database and a bunch of other, but you're consuming the application. I predict there will be enormous Hadoop consumption, but you'll get it because you're buying high-level business services.
So Andy, where do you stand on this cloud question? Oracle, after years of saying it would never enter the cloud and sort of bad mouthing the cloud, you're now a cloud vendor.
You knew that was coming, right?
I think there's a lot of confusion about what Larry was saying about cloud. But Larry's a funny guy. But we've been in this cloud software as a service business for a long time at Oracle, about 10 years. But Larry was sort of objecting to calling that something new because it's something we've been doing for years. But anyway, let's skip that one. I'd like to go back to one of the things Mike said, which I thought was a really good comment about clouds and big data, is that the enterprise customers want to have their Hadoop clusters next to their data sources, their transaction systems, et cetera. And that means most of them are going to want these systems on-premise in their data centers. However, there is this use case that I mentioned earlier. A lot of them want to get at this data on the internet. That data is already out there in the cloud. And I think there's a lot of opportunity out there for people who want to sort of integrate this information out there in the web and then help the enterprise guys get the information they want out of that and then let them bring it back onto their premises. So I think that's going to be an interesting use case for Hadoop on the cloud for the enterprise customers.
Yeah, I think there's one of the biggest challenges, I think, with this cloud versus on-premise is really one of sort of cultural mores of businesses. For businesses, nothing is more precious than their own data. And I'll even share a story that I encountered, which probably underscores this more than anything else. I was up in Amazon meeting with some of the Amazon Web Services folks recently. And I had a great couple of hours talking about how our bills keep going up and they want to be a great partner and help them make more money by turning around and giving them 50% of all of the money we take in, just being a sieve for Amazon revenues, essentially. And we had a great conversation. And then after that, I went down the street and I spoke to some folks at Amazon's ad business. Amazon actually has an advertising business, interestingly enough. And I said to them, you really should consider using Metamarkets. We're this great software as a service analytics, and we work with Demand Media and Financial Times. And point blank, the gentleman said to me, well, where do you host your stuff? And I said, well, on the Amazon public cloud. And he said, well, we could never trust you with our data. and I was sort of dumbfounded. I said, I literally just was down the street. How on earth does Amazon not trust Amazon's own cloud? And the answer is, he said, that data that's the crown jewels of Amazon's kingdom, is all of our customer data. We just can't, share that with you on our public cloud. That would be, foolish. So I think that, and that actually is the case. They stand by that opinion. A journalist called them and asked. They said, yes, it's correct. We don't trust, the public cloud with our own data. So I think it's a cultural issue, but I think it's a real issue too. And really, what it gets to is developing methodologies by which, I think a good analogy is the shipping industry. So, what's another place where similar to data? Data is property. And so for a long time, imagine you're running a business and you're moving your property, from place to place. And we've developed something in the shipping industry called a container. And, that was a big innovation whereby you can actually put your property into a container and ship it, around the world and trust that it won't be broken into. So I think there's and that took a long time for the shipping industry to innovate that. So I think there's a set of standards around how we can actually properly move data from the cloud between private clouds and public clouds that have to be developed. And I think a lot of us are betting our businesses on the direction that the cloud takes. How does it evolve? And it's an open question. But ultimately, we know, as you said, the data is out there on the cloud. So what could be more inefficient than all of us with these mobile applications and cloud services pulling data off of this cloud into some on-premise infrastructure and crunching it there? Nothing could be more inefficient. The only more inefficient thing would be taking data off of the wire and pushing it onto disk and then crunching it every 5 minutes, as opposed to doing it in memory, which wouldn't require Hadoop at all. I just think that this is a matter of cultural. And I think we saw this with the internet too 10 years ago, where a lot of companies were scared to death of having a public internet connection in their office. And now I don't think there's a Fortune 500. The only place I know that doesn't have public internet connections is the NSA. And I don't know that they're the most innovative when it comes to information technology, in my opinion.
You're right. It is a cultural attitude. It is a very real thing. But in covering this just over the past 3 or 4 years, it seems to me that it's already changed in that time, and that the people are shifting more towards an acceptance. Do you see that? I mean, how long will it take?
I think Mike's point is spot on. I could walk to, this is the heart of the data generation here in Silicon Valley. And whether it's LinkedIn or, we've had conversations with Facebook, we've had conversations with Netflix. The answer is we won't let our data off-site, off-premise. So it will happen with a younger generation of startups, but there is also a point, and I think Amazon has to be very wary of this, where people get big, and then they think, this is not safe. We actually need to move from Amazon into our own on-premise architecture. So I don't think the pendulum is swinging that quickly. I think it's going to be a while, and it requires standards around how we deal with data security before people get truly comfortable with their data out there. And I think, LinkedIn, all these data breaches that we are going to hear about, and they're only going to have more of them, certainly do not help calm the nerves of executives around, is the public cloud. They hear public cloud, they think public toilet, public pool. That's not a great place to be swimming in,
No same people are uploading all their
Amazon got here.
Well, let's.
Somebody has to represent Amazon.
All right.
bail them out.
2 things. First, we got a really sharp technical crew, but I don't know that my technical crew runs a more secure data center than Amazon runs. I mean, honest to God, you think about where the muscle is. I think those guys are pretty good. The other thing I'll say is, yeah, you're right. Everybody's hinky about their data. But just show of hands, who here in your organization, if you've got a Salesforce, who does not run Salesforce.com? Yeah, so like 11, right? What is more precious to you than who your customers are and what they're spending with you, right? It's taken a little time for Salesforce to get that ubiquitous, but I predict for business apps, you will see that evolution happen fairly soon. It won't be for everything, and particularly if I've got a big boatload of data that I've been collecting for years, man, it's really hard to let that go. But new applications and some new initiatives, I think will leak out of the cloud. And it'll really be what I said before. It'll be apps. It won't be a platform for data management. It'll be an app I care about that delivers a good service.
If you're concerned about Salesforce, think about if someone knew all your WebEx meetings for the last 2 years. Everywhere you met, who was in the meeting. Some of those recordings is an incredible amount of G2 on a company. I think the container that you're talking about is very sought after in the cloud, but it's also sought after on-prem. So they need some way to provision apps and do that within a container, right? And because internal on-prem Hadoop clusters tend to be shared resources as well. So there's quite a bit of the same sort of technology that has to be built to make that work also will service public cloud and vice versa.
Yeah. And what if some company knew who all your friends were and what you said to them?
Oh my God. Yeah.
Let's talk about the open source issue. You know, the reason we're all sitting here is because some people at Yahoo had the foresight to make this open source, and that's the reason all of you were able to take advantage of this code. Let's start with you again, Jay. I mean, as it stands right now, I mean, how important is it to Facebook that this is an open source platform? How much of the new code are you taking advantage of? How much are you giving back?
Yeah, I think it's essential for it to be open source and for it to continue to be open source. I think there's a whole set of different types of applications that is, as Mike said, I think the innovation around and the speed that we get to building these applications that people want to consume is going to happen faster if it happens in the open source community. If they get siloed off, then it's going to get more confusing. It's going to be hard to integrate this stuff. It's going to be more expensive, et cetera. I think that just given we are so early on in the maturity of what this system needs for the different types of use cases we have, that it is super essential for it to stay open source. I mean, obviously, we've worked really closely in terms of early on releases and taking stuff, trying it out, making changes, staying engaged with the folks in the community at Cloudera and other companies. We'll continue to do more. It's in our philosophy from an infrastructure perspective is that we work very closely and do a lot of stuff with open source that is now extended into the hardware stuff via OCP. But before that, MySQL, Memcache, Hadoop, and HBase, all of this stuff is actually pretty late in our evolution of open source at Facebook.
Got it. Mike Driscoll, how about you? You guys use the open source Apache version?
We do. We actually, after all of this hammering on Amazon, of course, we are very big users of Amazon. We use Elastic MapReduce. And I think Elastic MapReduce, for us, is, it's a service. We don't really pay much attention to what version of Hadoop we're running. We don't worry about upgrades. We don't worry about how many, we have some tuning in terms of the number of nodes we can allocate to our processing. But I think fundamentally that open source and services go hand in hand in a way that licensed software and maybe boxes go hand in hand. And the reason is that no one who runs a service is willing or interested in figuring out a way to have a licensed proprietary software put into their stack. So for Metamarkets, we can't really put any proprietary software anywhere in our stack. So Hadoop has been great, as have been other open source libraries, because we're not worried about someone coming to us and wondering what's underneath the covers of this service and trying to extract more value from us as a result.
I do think it's actually one important thing from a cultural perspective is that it's very important from a building the team perspective, right? So if you want to actually build the discipline to be able to run Hadoop for a specific application or for, at a company like Facebook or LinkedIn or whatever, actually it being open source and actually being able to draw from the community, being able to attract folks from the community to come work on this and being able to show their work back to their peers in the industry, I think it's like really, really important from a cultural perspective.
Now, Mike Olson, you've played in the open source world for a long time. There's obviously a difference between being a consumer of an open source technology like Facebook and being a company like Cloudera, which is trying to build a business around it.
Yes.
What do you have to do differently there to do that?
So over the course of my career, I've been involved in a bunch of open source projects. Way back in the late 70s, early 80s, I worked on Berkeley Unix while I was at Berkeley. And actually, Bill Joy at Berkeley, well, actually, I think he said it when he was at Sun Microsystem. He had what is really, for me, the definitive quote about open source software. What he said is, all the smart people work somewhere else. No matter how good your company is, the smartest people in the world don't work for you. They live in Estonia or in India or they work for your competitors. The advantage of open source software is that it allows people in different organizations in different countries to collaborate and to collaborate on the basis of competence and ability, right? So open source, I think, really is a better way to develop software. We're committed to open source for two reasons, right? One is the one I just laid out for you. So calendar 2011, squint your eyes, and Neil, you may remember what we said in the board. I think I had 50 engineers on staff, right? That year, 521 different engineers made contributions to the Hadoop ecosystem in which we operate. That is to say, ladies and gentlemen, I only had to carry 10% of the payroll working on the product that I ship. That's like magic, right? I figured that out, right? You should try it. It works good. In addition to sharing the cost, the platform moves faster. More people, more workloads, innovate in new ways. But also, what I said before about frictionless adoption is true. What we have found is that when there is an open source alternative to a proprietary platform, especially infrastructure offering in the market, CIOs, customers prefer the open source. They like the idea of not being locked into a single vendor long term. And I think you'll see a continued march in that direction. It began with operating systems, with Linux, which is really most people's first experience with open source. But the database layer, MySQL and Postgres, did great work in driving adoption there as well. JBoss and others created middleware. Hadoop is really the first open source project that we've seen that is de novo from the ground up innovative. That is, we're not knocking off an established market of software from proprietary vendors. Linux, we knew about operating systems. Postgres, we knew about databases. With Hadoop, we're implementing services that the big web properties discovered they needed. We're inventing something new. The collaboration that we get, the value we get out of working with the open source community broadly is great. And I tell you, just flat out, I don't believe any single vendor can outcompete a global open source community. It's just not possible. There's too much intelligence, too many smart people who work somewhere else.
But you also offer sort of proprietary software around that open source code to enterprise. Right?
No, this is important. This is really fundamental. This is our strategy, right, you guys? So the platform absolutely needs to be open source. But look at the history of open source companies. Red Hat got to $1 billion in revenue this year, and God bless Jim Whitehurst. A phenomenal accomplishment. I will tell you, however, that I believe that Red Hat is a freak of nature, a historical oddity, never going to happen again. If you look at the rest of the population of open source companies, MySQL, when it got acquired by Sun Microsystems, depending on if you trust Sun's statement or Martin Miko's, 50 or 60 million bucks, right? Which is, by the way, pretty good revenues. But it's way, way short of $1 billion. And it goes down from there. JBoss, 37 maybe. Spring, 20 when they got acquired. Sleepy Cat, am I allowed to say?
I don't know.
Sleepy Cat was at 12, trailing 12. And by the way, we were hugely proud of the business that we had built. But it is fantastically difficult to build a services-only business on open source. So my view, the winning open source company of the future looks a lot more like Oracle, Microsoft, IBM. Open source platform software, which, by the way, drives adoption and everybody likes it. But we reserve the right to build unique proprietary value that complements that platform and that you get uniquely from us, a reason to buy from Cloudera. The product we build is called Cloudera Manager, and it makes it blindingly easy, if you don't have a room full of Stanford PhDs, to run a Hadoop cluster in production, right? That's how we make a living. And you will see us introduce more proprietary complements, not replacements for the platform software. If it's about the platform, data storage, data processing, data analysis, it is open source. But we reserve the right to charge enterprises for software that they need, which complements it, because they need a vendor who's going to be around for a long time, and that means we need a revenue stream. And it's working pretty good. And by the way, I've done this a few times. This is not my first open source company, so we've played with the model a little bit. I just think this is the right way to go to market.
John, some people tend to contrast what you've done with MapR to what, say, a Cloudera has done. Do you see the models as that different?
I think actually the companies are probably more alike than different. I mean, You know, we don't have to out-innovate the entire open source community. We've got a bulk of our distribution is open source projects. I think what Mike was describing there, and open source does bring the same benefits. You get ubiquity. If a platform's free, people are going to use it. And if you're trying to attract development resources, you get that draw into the community. So I agree with those things. I think the ideology around open core is, and that's if you spend any time on Sand Hill Road, you'll hear that, hey, we looked at this company, we're thinking and investing. They're doing an open core strategy. They're just looking at kind of a simplistic view of, well, there'll be some popular open source project, and we'll try to gain some commercial value out of that and add tools and apps on top. And I think if that's what the technology requires to be acceptable, that could work. And I think for things that were more commoditizations of a marketplace, so if you look at like, you know, Linux is a commoditization of the Unix market or technology, right? So, you know, in 1991, you had to very carefully choose Solaris or HPUX to run an app because they were highly differentiated from other Unix offerings. Well, by the time Linux came around, you could pretty much run any of them, right? And the same with MySQL. I think early 90s, huge battles between Oracle, Sybase, and Formix and others to battle it out who had the best platform. And then many, many years later, you have a commoditization. And MySQL comes and you say, hey, there's a free alternative out there I could use. So when you look at something that has to innovate at a really rapid pace like Hadoop does, I mean, it's a good platform. It still has a lot more to grow. Certainly you don't want to try to out-develop the open source community, but you want to address the high-value issues. I mean, what are really the things that organizations need to broaden the use cases, to move more from batch to real-time, to have more open APIs, and address those needs, whether they're part of the platform or an add-on top of the platform. I think you really need to address the needs of the marketplace and not be so concerned over whether it's a platform or a management tool or an app. And I think we can really move the needle forward that way. So I do think the companies are far more alike than different. Also, with regards to professional services and education, I think you have to provide that in an early market as well. You know, help customers with use case identification and such, and help train their engineering staffs on how to do Hive programming and Minute and some of the other technologies. But in general, I think the main difference there is the open core philosophy, and is that an ideology? We chose to be more driven by the needs of the market, not as much by that ideology.
Good. We'll take questions from the audience here shortly, but before we do, Mike, Olson, I'm just curious, do you see, you know, your model is, in this grand scheme of things, is vastly different than MapR?
Yes.
I thought you would say that. So how and why?
Look, with respect, and I think that John's engineers have done a good job of building a file system, but I don't believe that you build differentiation at the file system layer anymore. It's 2012, for God's sake, right? The enterprise advantages early captured by the MapR system have largely been eroded because the community has focused on fixing those problems. Most of all, though, if my claim earlier is true, if you want open source software because it eliminates vendor lock-in, then with an open source platform, with the distribution that we provide, frankly, the distribution that other vendors in the market provide, Hortonworks is a good example, you can kick the vendor out, and we cannot turn off access to your data, we can't turn off access to your analytics, we can't turn off access to your data processing. That is yours, not ours, right? If you've got proprietary platform components, and in this case the file system, your ability to use that file system disappears at the termination of your license for it. That is, your data is in an important way not yours, right? You've got to do work to get it out if you can get it out. I think that's a mistake. John clearly doesn't, because they built a business that is predicated on that. We will see. But our commitment to open source is not ideological. It is strategic. It's a better way to build and distribute open source software, and my bet is that it is the way that enterprises want to consume enterprise infrastructure.
I'm just going to.
Well, hold on. I think John's owed a response here.
Can I defend him?
Was he twitching?
What?
Because I was trying to.
I'm going to defend.
Mike would like to defend you, John. Is that
This is one of those Jane, you ignorant slut situations here. you know, I think, well, we did build a lot more than a file system, so there's a lot more to it than that. But, you know, I think the proof's going to be out in the marketplace. I think most of the customers aren't that interested in open source ideology. I think it's true that you can attract talent into an IT department by deploying open source. I think that's one of the reasons why Yahoo originally open sourced Hadoop, is they said, how can we staff a higher quality set of engineers that are on par with, at the time, Google, and now probably presently Facebook, and it was a way to draw that talent in. I don't think that JPM Chase wants to do that. I don't think Amex wants to do that. I don't think Boeing wants to do that. I don't think most of the Web 2.0s, I mean, you're kind of talking about the, you know, the tip of the pyramid as far as organizations when you're talking about Facebook, right? So some of those drivers seem to be less relevant, and I think you need to fix the problems that the market's asking to be solved. Early on, we tried to collaborate on this. MC Shrivas, who's my co-founder, and I, before founding the company and probably for the first year after, we spent a lot of time over at Yahoo meeting with Eric and Sanjay and that, and we said, hey, we think there's something we could solve together here. And they're very interested in the technology. They thought these were relevant, very high priority issues to be resolved, but they didn't collaborate, and I think one of the reasons was they were spinning out Hortonworks, right? So they felt like it was probably better to try to maintain control of that open source project within an Apache project rather than, you know, collaborate outside and lose some of the control over that project. So when you get into open source, I think there is all the values that Mike has really stated here. Access to talent, gaining ubiquity in a market with a free technology and such. But there are a lot of politics in the open source community as well. So it's not, and it's different depending on your situation. So if you're the sole creator of the technology, so if you look at 10gen, they probably own most of the MongoDB developers. So they can innovate quickly, they can move the platform forward, they can make decisions, they can fund development. Then on the other end of the spectrum, you might be an aggregator, right? So there's a lot of different projects out there produced by multiple organizations, and there isn't really a controlling, you know, single creator. I think it's a different situation, and that's more the situation with Hadoop. There isn't one company that has all the committers. There's a number of companies, and now you've got 2 commercial vendors in there plus MapR that are trying to figure out how do we move this forward. So there's a lot more to it than open source versus proprietary. I think it's a more complex analysis than that.
Yeah, my quick defense of the proposition for MapR would be, what appealed to me with that pitch that I've heard, my engineers have heard, is that ultimately lots of things will disappear in cost, but what we can't get rid of is the cost of energy. And ultimately, I do think that actually there is room for innovation at the file system layer, because right now Hadoop is very inefficient. So I think anything that can promise to, you know, reduce the energy usage of all of these hard disks is something worth looking at. So that's my defense of building a new file system.
Yeah, and again, we've done much more than a file system.
Not
I love to
just
be
you guys.
pigeonholed as a file system.
Anybody who's working on a file system.
One of my investors is in the audience here. He's going, is that what we invested in? I didn't know we were a file system company. The vendor lock-in thing is also an interesting one. We've had real easy time moving apps between distributions. So we're, you know, binary compatible. Actually, Cade, you're actually interviewed one of our recent customers that said how easy it was to move from one of the competing platforms to MapR. And actually moving off is just as easy. I mean, it's the APIs we put into the product are, I would argue, more standard than Hadoop. So we open up a POSIX compliant, you know, file system in one regards, which there's more POSIX out there than Hadoop. We allow you to mount it via NFS. There's far more file-based applications out there. You could browse your Hadoop cluster using Windows Explorer. If you look at what we've done with security, we've done Linux-based standard security enhanced Linux, pluggable authentication, very mainstream stuff. We built NoDBC drivers, so tools built at Oracle and other database tools can work with your Hadoop data. So we've really tried not to build in, you know, niche-y proprietary sort of APIs in that. And really the things we've added are very standards-based, and there's, you know, binary compatibility across all the different Hadoop distributions in an API level.
Let's take questions from the audience here.
So on the hardware side, for a second, open compute as you know, probably one of the major implementation aspects in the near future of how Hadoop's going to be implemented as you know, physically, right? One of the primary premises there is kind of a cleaning up, cutting down the complexity of the hardware, and you know, just being predictable, easy to manage, and lower power, lower cost. Now, what do you think about something that kind of goes in the other direction? Do you think that as scalability becomes an issue, something like hardware acceleration will be anywhere in any aspect of Hadoop that's going to come up?
So I have two thoughts on that, which is one is I think we are so far away from that right now because there is so much low-hanging fruit in the stack in terms of efficiency. You know, you look at HDFS, you look at MapReduce. These are not projects that the community has spent a lot of time making efficient. You know, there's no way to say, hey, this is data that I'm accessing in MapReduce jobs frequently. You know, keep this organized. You know, spread this across more spindles so that I can get more throughput here. Put it in a memory. Keep it in memory. If you think about a 1,000-node Hadoop cluster, if I could utilize, you know, 64 gigs or 128 gigs of memory to store hot data and be able to do either real-time processing or the batch processing in just using what we have today. So I think we are really underutilizing what we have today, and it's not just about how fast you can spin the disks. I think it's like, yes, you can optimize for that, but I think there is memory, there's flash, there's the network side of it, there's, you know, depending on the job, do you need to store 8 copies of the data if it's accessed a lot in a lot of different jobs, or do you need to store 2 copies for just redundancy because it's used once every year? There's no dynamic allocation of that kind of stuff. So I think there's a lot of really cool things that we can do with the existing stack before we even get to. I think hardware acceleration is like a waste at this point because I think the incremental gain you get in hardware compared to the inefficiency that we have today in it is, you know, clear.
Next question.
So, comment about the open source being ideology. I think it's offensive, if not intellectually dishonest. But question to panel is, so it was a database, now it's Hadoop. What is next? What do you guys think?
Can I ask one question?
Yeah.
Are you directing that offensive comment at me?
No. I think to your competition.
Oh.
But thanks for
I'm
clarification.
sorry, I misunderstood.
No. I think saying that open source is ideology, I think it's offensive. I think every time your engineers take a look at sample code or use something that is out there in open source, it's more than ideology. It's a lot more than that. So that is just a comment. I don't think that was respectful to open source community.
Oh, no disrespect intended. We've put a fair amount with regards to fixes and patches out there ourselves, so I understand that, yeah.
I appreciate that. Apology accepted.
You could have said, Jane, you ignorant slut.
Yeah. But the question to all the panel members is, what do you think after MapReduce? What is the next big thing? What should we expect?
I'll take one stab, which is, you know, ultimately I think we're seeing this open source as a commoditization wave, right? So we've seen at the Hadoop layer. I think ultimately we're starting to see some of it at further up the stack. The visualization, there are new libraries out there. One in particular came out of Stanford called D3, which is a JavaScript-based visualization package. But in my view, I think what's missing right now is a truly distributed in-memory, column-oriented analytics store. So right now you've got Hadoop at the processing layer. Hadoop is essentially a processing layer. And what you really need is you would like to have a distributed database layer on top of Hadoop. And to date, I don't see right now anything that exists like that. But HBase is not in memory, and it's not really designed for like analytical type jobs. HBase is essentially a key value store, as are other NoSQL.
How about Druid?
So Metamarkets is trying to open source one of these data stores, but we're not alone. I know Scuba is a project at Facebook. I know that if you talk to engineers in the Valley, there are a lot of people working on this kind of data store that essentially sits on top of Hadoop. So I think there's probably lots of Hadoop things that were out there that didn't get open sourced before. So I think that's my take on it.
I'd say if you want to know what the future holds, the guy who created the Hadoop project, a guy named Doug Cutting, was hired by Yahoo when he was working on that and was there for a while. Now he works at Cloudera. And I've had this conversation with him, and he finds it a little offensive, so I'll give it all to you as well. So Google invented MapReduce and GFS in the early 2000s and published the paper in 2004. And then Yahoo went and implemented an open source version of that with considerable help from the community at large. People always talk about Microsoft with some awe as a fast follower. You're not innovative, but watch what happens in the market. You know, if you look at it, Yahoo's a slow follower, right? And so Google publishes this paper, and years later, there is something available in the open source community. If you want to know what the interesting, large-scale, high-performance data processing infrastructure looks like of the future, my advice would be to read the Google research papers that are coming out right now. So the in-memory, columnar store, all that stuff, you bet, man, it's happening. And I'll also say the MapReduce 2 work that the community produced, largely actually a couple of guys out of Hortonworks, pretty interesting. It generalizes the scheduling infrastructure for MapReduce and allows you to run a bunch of different execution models on that large-scale distributed infrastructure.
But will Google open source? I mean, they have something in Dremel, right?
Google does not and never has open sourced its own internal infrastructure. If you ask them, they say, but you don't have Google infrastructure, right? So why would we give you the Google cloud? Well, do you know good, right? Puny mortal, right? But they do publish papers about what they do, and the community then goes and implements that.
They also see it as their crown jewels. Also, I mean, that their internal infrastructure is so important to them, and they do make that argument. I think that's a valid point. But also, they just see that as a competitive advantage, and they're willing to give the research papers out, but not necessarily give the code.
Yeah. But I think that comment's very interesting. Google published a paper about a year ago where they basically said, well, we have all these internal users at Google, like analysts, and they're not PhDs from Stanford, and they can't use this thing. And so we're going to implement a relational database, a SQL relational database on top of our MapReduce code. And so I think one of the answers to the questions, which I didn't want to provide, but I think is going to be, we have to go back to the future. So you're going to reinvent the same set of technologies that people have been using for BI and analytics for the last 15, 20 years, and build them on top of the Hadoop platform. That is one direction the community will probably go in. There are probably lots of other directions, but I think that's an interesting direction. I don't know if that's a good direction to invest in or not, but I think that is likely what's going to happen. There, people talk about SQL is bad, but at the end of the day, everybody decides, well, it's not so bad after all. Maybe we should build a in-memory parallel relational database with column stores and all that kind of good stuff. And of course, all the relational database vendors are working on that stuff too. So
we're working on
it'll be very
boxes.
interesting.
You put all of that into a box and then you
Stand
call
by.
it cloud.
Hadoop 11G coming soon.
Another question?
Yes, Merritt Stidson with McKesson. So, Michael, this is more for you. So we're very interested in trying to leverage the cloud so that we can quick start our programs, those kind of things, get it up so that we're not focusing on the infrastructure. However, on the other side, we're very concerned with the fact that we're a healthcare company and the cost of losing data is very high. So to your point on the AdWorks, we're finding it very difficult to find any company that will indemnify us from the systems that they own, maintain, and manage as a PaaS solution or as a SaaS solution. Teradata, in my conversations with them, said, well, we'll carry the risk, but none of the financial risk, which, as far as I'm concerned, that's the important part. So with that being a major inhibitor to us trying to leverage the cloud, do you have any insights that you can help with?
So I think this is a case where the legal system has to play catch-up, because we have faced this issue with many of our clients who not just to ask about indemnification, if there's a breach, a data breach, but also, typically, I guess there's this thing called escrow, where if we, as a startup, we've got more money now with our Series B, but as a startup, if we go out of business, they want to have access to the software, and typically you put this into escrow. My view is it's all about, we have regulatory and business infrastructures for managing risk. The risk of data breach in the cloud is as high as it's just another form of risk. But I think I would look to legal folks in the audience. If you want to start a good legal practice, focus on some of the legal implications of people operating software as a service businesses in the cloud, because I've called around to a lot of Silicon Valley law firms to try to get people who can help us address this. Ultimately, it's an insurance question. But I will say this, it's still one of fear. I think that ultimately it's sort of like the way we pay attention to global news. We're more aware of tornadoes and plane crashes because we pay attention to the big events. We're more aware of the big breaches that are happening when all of our data is on the cloud, right? But I would argue that the cloud makes those small breaches less likely to occur. So it's less likely that your guy leaves his USB plug in the airport and you have a small data breach, but these big data breaches are going to be more common. So I don't know that overall there's more risk. It's just the nature and the distribution of that risk is changing, and we need to have some legal advances to help address that as well.
Another question?
Bruce Perelskin from McAfee. Thank you for the security question. That was great. This is a great panel in the true tradition of the Churchill Club. Lots of controversy. Thank you for talking about the technology the way you have. But it's really interesting to hear where you think the applications are going to go. We talked a little bit about enterprises are going to look at how to merge their data with the internet. How do you really see it being rolled out to large enterprises? I get it for Yahoo and Facebook and Google and people like that, but when you get to somebody like a McKesson or companies like that, how do you see them rolling out this type of a technology?
So I can talk a little bit about that because we do see it. There are two common adoption patterns, right? The first is the company brings us in, they believe they have a big data problem. There are one or two specific business questions, business use cases they want to stand up and run on Hadoop. So they've got the data, they want to build net new analytics that they've never run before. And those are very focused, very well contained, very easy to understand problems, and they love those applications. Generally, they're quite successful with them. They run them then regularly to understand their business, and that becomes part of their normal business operations. That point application, whether it's data processing or data analysis, I think is important and generates, in our experience, the largest concentrated value. That is, one customer, single data processing task running on Hadoop at massive scale drove the top line by 2%. CEO notices this kind of stuff. So specific applications are valuable, but they're very narrow and they're aimed at just one thing. I think that there is an opportunity to arm business analysts with new tools that are exploratory in the way that MicroStrategy and SAS have been on more traditional business data for a long time. And I'll say honestly, I don't think we're there yet. I do see in the partner ecosystem that we've got and in the community broadly, those kind of tools emerging. But the way that you visualize, the way you wrap your head around petabytes of data, particularly when it's not numerical but more complex, more different data types, is different, requires new, sometimes even academic techniques to be applied to business. So those applications can take a little bit longer to roll out. But I think that's when it's going to get really interesting. You'll be able to explore your data and have it tell you things besides just answering the question you asked. And I think that will catch on over the next couple of years as those apps come online.
And I agree with Mike on that one. And the thing I've seen too, though, is once they roll out that first use case, they roll out the second within maybe even a quarter or two. So it grows very quickly. They have to kind of get their brain around clustering algorithms, recommendation engines, machine learning. It's a different thought process, and then really inventory their structured, unstructured data, public, private data, whatever is available to them. Once they get up and running, though, it seems to roll out pretty quickly. So the implementations seem to grow pretty quickly over time.
Two more questions.
Janet George from Yahoo. So one of the biggest decisions that Yahoo made, the best decision, was really to open source the technologies. Now, Zookeeper was very quickly adopted by Facebook because they experienced the scale, the issue of the problem with scale. And Yahoo was forced to innovate because they had scale. A lot of the industry is sort of lagging behind, right? So how do people, what are you seeing? I think in the next 5 years, it'll be easier for, as the big data gets larger and larger, people to come into this. What are you seeing? We need more acceleration of adoption. How is that going to happen?
On Zookeeper in particular, I will say that actually adoption is very broad, and it's much broader than just Hadoop, by the way. It's great sort of distributed coordination infrastructure. It works fantastically well, so we see lots of people using it on non-Hadoop workloads. If your question is what's going to drive adoption of this ecosystem of projects, I think it's panels like this. Well, that was my best line of the night. No, we need to drive awareness among business users, more applications and more real business use cases. But that pain caused you to invent the platform. You needed to do that. Now that it's invented, regular people can use it. Mm-hmm. And that's why we love the work that Yahoo does, that Facebook does. You guys really are driving the platform forward 5 years in advance of the rest of the market, but the rest of the market's going to get there.
Yeah, and maybe to jump in real quick on that, I think, I'm sure MapR and Cloudera have seen this at the forefront, but I think there's this awakening among CIOs of the Fortune 500 and Fortune 5000 that I was at a banking conference in Toronto, and I quoted our number that we crunch 100 terabytes a day and what our infrastructure cost was. And the JP Morgan executive there said, wait, stop. I think you can't be serious. That's just impossible. So I think there's this awakening that, wait, we're paying too much for our infrastructure. Silicon Valley was the place where the necessity, if you couldn't crunch the data cheap, you couldn't crunch it at all. But I think around the country, other CIOs are thinking, well, especially on Wall Street, they're thinking, why am I paying, I don't want to pay a lot for that data muffler, as it were. So I think this awakening will definitely spark a lot of adoption.
I think there's another thing going on, though, too, is, back in 08, 09, you looked at NoSQL platforms, and, the list goes on. It wasn't just Hadoop. It was Voldemort, Hypertable, VoltDB, Clustrix, Couchbase. You could rattle them off, a long, long list of potential NoSQL winners. And one of the things I think I see today is it's become more of a safe choice than it was before. So if you look at the number of vendors, the amount of technology, the community, people trained, the ability to access technology and services around Hadoop, I think it's become more of a safe choice for a CIO to make. So if he's going to move outside of the comforts of Oracle or traditional data warehouse or something, I think they're more comfort going to Hadoop that they look at that and say, it'll take me on a technology ride. I'm going to have the broadest range of product and services. I'm going to be able to hire people that want to work on this. Eventually, I'll be able to hire people who already know how to build apps and run them in production, as opposed to, let's say if you're going to make, I hate to pick on one project because they all have value, but if you looked at a nichier technology, you're much more reticent to place a bet there. Even if it fit your initial use case, you might say, well, where am I going to be in a year with this or 2 years? So I think it's become a bit of a safe choice at this point, relatively.
Yeah, I think this is exactly what's happened at Facebook, right? So many years ago, we started out, we tried to get this thing propped up, running, getting data flowing in, trying to do preliminary reports and analytics, being like, okay, this is cool, we can crunch a lot of data, work on scaling, making it faster, crunch more data. Then as it's more and more of the data is in this platform or in these platforms, you want to do more and more with it, right? So it's really important to us that, hey, we have all this data stored there. It's not just about analytics. It's about, and my kind of hope is that as this stuff stabilizes and becomes the norm, that we actually look at saying, okay, well, now that the data is there, MapReduce isn't the only framework that operates on this data. We have something that's, hey, I just need an object store. I want to store PDFs and presentations and email attachments or that kind of stuff. Why not? I have all this commodity commodity hardware or big hardware, big appliance hardware. I have the knowledge in-house. I have the other data that I may want to tie it into. Another example that we are absolutely doing a ton of innovation and work on at Facebook is just representing data in terms of a graph, right? Graph analytics. Everything today out of Hadoop is a table, and it's great, and it answers a lot of analytic questions. But if you want to do things like recommendation engines, or you want to do things about sort of smart shopping, or you want to do things like fraud detection, very secure, like very intensive understanding of what your users are doing and fraud and other security things, there are other structures of this data that are going to be far, far more efficient in terms of asking something of the system and getting the data, and then the data telling you something you didn't even know to ask of it. And I don't think that MapReduce is the only, MapReduce is great for a big chunk of things that we know here and now, but that's like a couple years from now, it's going to just be, it's going to be like the Linux. It's going to be like, yeah, whatever, that's easy, that's what we do. But it's these other applications that are going to use the data in other structured ways that we don't even comprehend today.
But I think that's the key point is if you're a big bank or big enterprise, you need to, if you want them to go to Hadoop, you need to show them something new that they can't do today. I can already do fraud detection, whatever. But if you come up with a set of new innovative solutions they can't do today using traditional technologies, that's what's going to really draw them. And I think that's where the jury is out. We don't have a lot of those yet today, but I think that's what's going to be needed to get the enterprises to really move to Hadoop.
That should do it. Thanks to our panelists. And thanks for coming.
Yeah, I'd like to thank our speakers for sharing their insights and perspectives, and want to give you a small token of thanks from the Churchill Club. We have a fine tradition of giving you a T-shirt. Since it's Silicon Valley, you get a T-shirt. And please join me in thanking the speakers for a great program. I look forward to hopefully seeing you next week at the Oxford Union Debate.